My name is Ari Berman. I am a senior contributing writer for The Nation magazine and the author of the new book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. So I was always curious and a little bit of a pain in the ass. So journalism was a good profession for me. I got interested in journalism late in high school, and I decided I wanted to go to journalism school. So I went to the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University for undergraduate, and I knew I wanted to write, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to write about. And what I thought was cool about journalism was you could basically write about whatever you were interested in. So I was initially interested in music, so I wrote about music. And then I was interested in art and culture, so I wrote about art and culture. And then I gradually got more interested in politics. A lot of things happened when I was in college that made me more political. My freshman year of college was Florida 2000. And then came 9/11, and then came the war in Iraq. So there was these series of events that really opened my eyes to the political process and to the world in general. And I then studied abroad my junior year in Geneva, Switzerland, and we studied the UN and all these international institutions, and this was as the war in Iraq was beginning. And then I came home and I did an internship at this place called Editor and Publisher, which covered the newspaper industry, and we really covered the coverage of the war in Iraq. So we looked very closely at how newspapers were covering it, and we noticed that there was a real lack of skepticism among the press in terms of how they covered the war. This was the post-9/11 atmosphere, and there seemed to be a feeling of whatever the commander-in-chief wants to do is best for the country. And both myself and my editor at the time, Greg Mitchell, thought the press wasn't asking the historically tough questions they should have. So that made me gravitate more towards places like The Nation, which were more skeptical of the war and were more independent, and unlike the New York Times and the Washington Post, weren't being squeezed by the government to follow some sort of line. And so that made me want to do more kind of independent, alternative investigative journalism as opposed to just working for a big mainstream publication. So then after working for Editor and Publisher, I joined The Nation as an intern, and I wrote some pieces for them, and then I went back, finished college, and then after graduating in 2004, I joined The Nation, and I've been there ever since in a variety of roles. I wasn't really interested in voting rights when I started out in journalism. It wasn't like this was my calling. My parents didn't meet in Selma. I didn't grow up in the segregated South. I mean, I was aware of the civil rights movement and what had occurred, but it wasn't my particular passion when I started out in journalism. I was principally concerned when I started writing political journalism about the war in Iraq. And then I got into bigger issues. And first I started blogging for The Nation and writing some longer pieces about American politics, and then from 2005 to 2007, I went down to Washington and worked out of our Washington bureau with David Korn, who at the time was our Washington editor, and I covered Congress and the Capitol and a little bit of the Supreme Court, and so there was just a lot going on. I ended up arriving in DC the day of Hurricane Katrina. And so I thought I was covering what Karl Rove had called the permanent Republican majority, but I ended up covering the dissolution of that majority. And I really kind of stumbled into covering voting rights. I had written one piece for Rolling Stone before, and I was looking for another piece to write for them because I knew an editor there, and I was thinking of pieces that might be good for that magazine, and I noticed in early 2011 a bunch of states had introduced new voting restrictions. This was following the 2010 election when Republicans had very large majorities in a bunch of states, and there were things that were being introduced to, for example, shut down voter registration drives and cut back early voting and require strict forms of government-issued ID to cast a ballot. And there was an explosion of these new restrictions, and it was occurring not just in southern states, but in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Iowa, swing states that did not have the same history of voting discrimination. And so I noticed that this was an important national trend, an important and disturbing national trend, and one that was not being covered elsewhere. And so I pitched this piece for Rolling Stone and ended up becoming the first national magazine piece to look at this new fight over voting post-2010. And I didn't really realize that the piece would have such a big impact, and I didn't really realize that voting rights would become something that I would cover ever since then. But basically, the piece had a lot of reaction, and then there were new laws passed, there were efforts that were challenged in court. Of course, there was then a challenge to the Voting Rights Act itself, and that made me very interested in both the current struggle over voting rights, but also the history of the Voting Rights Act and of voting rights in general, and that led me to write my book, Give Us the Ballot.